In a quiet little town where everyone knew each other by name, life moved at a slow and predictable pace. The streets were lined with neatly trimmed lawns, children played outside until sunset, and the air always carried the faint smell of freshly baked cookies wafting from kitchen windows. It was the kind of place where nothing exciting or dangerous ever seemed to happen. For 12-year-old Emily Dawson, this peaceful suburb was her whole world. And in that world, there was no one more important to her than Max. Max wasn't just any dog. He was a golden retriever with shaggy fur that glimmered like sunlight when he ran through the yard. His tail wagged so hard it looked like it might take off into the sky. To Emily, Max was more than a pet. He was family. He had been by her side since she was 6 years old, helping her through the toughest days after her mom passed away. When she felt lonely or scared, Max would rest his head on her lap as if to say, "I'm here." Together, they spent countless afternoons playing fetch, exploring the neighborhood, and simply sitting under the big oak tree in their backyard, watching the clouds drift by. On this particular evening, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Emily grabbed Max's favorite tennis ball and headed out to the front yard. She threw the ball as far as she could, laughing as Max sprinted after it, his ears flapping wildly in the breeze. Over and over, they played, their laughter filling the otherwise calm street. But then, something changed. A loud commotion broke the serenity. A man shouting, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps pounding against the pavement. Emily turned toward the noise and saw 2 police officers running down the sidewalk. They were chasing a dog, a scruffy brown mutt, that darted across yards, clearly frightened. One officer held a leash while the other shouted orders into a radio clipped to his shoulder. Emily froze, unsure of what was happening. Before she could react, the scruffy dog bolted onto her property, disappearing behind a bush near the driveway. Max, sensing the tension, barked loudly and stood protectively in front of Emily. The officers skidded to a stop in front of the Dawsons' house. Their faces were flushed, their breathing heavy. Without hesitation, one of them pointed at Max, mistaking him for the runaway dog they'd been pursuing. "That's it," he yelled, raising his weapon. Time seemed to slow down for Emily. Her heart pounded in her chest as she screamed, "No, wait. That's not the dog." But it was too late. A single shot rang out, echoing through the neighborhood. Max let out a sharp yelp before collapsing onto the grass. Emily dropped to her knees beside him, tears streaming down her face as she called his name over and over. Blood seeped into the green blades beneath him, staining them crimson. The officers froze, realizing their mistake. One muttered an apology, but the damage was done. Max was gone. Emily's cries brought neighbors rushing outside. Some tried to comfort her, while others demanded answers from the stunned officers. No explanation could undo what had happened. As word spread through the community, shock turned to anger. How could this have happened? Why hadn't the officers checked before firing? These questions hung heavy in the air, unanswered. Unbeknownst to everyone, including Emily, her father, John Dawson, was due to return home the next day. Little did the officers know, they had just crossed paths with someone who wouldn't let this tragedy go unanswered. John Dawson stepped off the plane earlier than planned, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder and a weary look in his eyes. He had been looking forward to this leave, a rare chance to spend time with his daughter, Emily, and try to rebuild some semblance of normalcy after months of being deployed in hostile territories. But as soon as he walked through the front door of their modest suburban home, he knew something was wrong. The house felt unusually quiet, almost heavy with sorrow. Emily sat on the couch, her knees pulled up to her chest, staring blankly at the wall. Her golden hair, usually so full of life, hung limply around her face. There were tear streaks on her cheeks, and her red-rimmed eyes told him she'd been crying for hours. John's heart sank. This wasn't the bubbly, spirited girl he'd left behind. Something had shattered her spirit. "Emily," he said softly, setting his bag down and kneeling in front of her. "What's going on? What happened?" At first, she didn't respond. She just stared at him, as if unsure how to begin. Then, slowly, haltingly, she told him everything. About Max, about the police officers chasing another dog, about the gunshot that ended her best friend's life. As she spoke, her voice cracked, and fresh tears spilled down her face. John listened silently, his jaw tightening with each word. By the time she finished, his hands were clenched into fists, though he tried to keep his expression calm for Emily's sake. He hugged her tightly, letting her cry into his shoulder. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," he whispered. "We'll figure this out together." But inside, John's mind was racing. He had spent years training to stay composed under pressure, to think strategically even when emotions ran high. Now those skills kicked in automatically. First, he needed to understand exactly what had happened. That evening, after Emily fell asleep, John began gathering information. He reviewed the body camera footage from the officers involved, which he requested through official channels. The video showed chaotic scenes, shouting, running, confusion, but also glaring inconsistencies. One officer claimed Max had charged at them aggressively, but the footage clearly showed the dog standing still, barking defensively. Another insisted they hadn't realized it wasn't the same dog until it was too late. As John watched the video again and again, his anger simmered beneath the surface. These weren't split-second decisions made in the heat of battle. These were reckless actions taken without proper judgment. Worse, the more he dug, the more unsettling details emerged. Both officers had histories of complaints filed against them. Excessive force, racial profiling, false arrests. But none of those cases had ever gone anywhere. It was as if they were untouchable, shielded by higher-ups who turned a blind eye. John's military instincts told him this wasn't an isolated incident. Corruption rarely operated alone. It thrived in networks. And if these officers could get away with killing an innocent dog, what else might they have done? For Emily's sake, and for Max, he knew he couldn't let this slide. Justice wasn't just about holding someone accountable. It was about making sure no one else suffered because of negligence or malice. Still, John understood the stakes. He was a man trained to operate in shadows, not someone who sought attention. But this was personal now. Every memory of Max wagging his tail, every laugh shared between father and daughter during backyard games, it all fueled his resolve. He wouldn't act rashly, but he would act decisively. Whatever it took, whoever stood in his way, John vowed to uncover the truth and ensure that justice was served. For Emily, for Max, and for the fragile trust that held their community together. John Dawson wasn't a man who rushed into things without a plan. Years of training in Delta Force had taught him the importance of patience, precision, and preparation. He knew that acting on raw emotion would only lead to mistakes, and mistakes could cost dearly. So, as much as his heart ached for Emily and burned with anger over Max's death, he forced himself to take a step back and think carefully about his next move. The first thing John did was dig deeper into the officers involved in the shooting. Using skills honed during countless covert missions, he accessed public records, social media profiles, and even old news articles. What he found disturbed him. Both officers had troubling patterns in their pasts. Complaints from citizens alleging excessive force, accusations of planting evidence, and whispers of corruption. None of these claims had ever led to serious consequences because they were either dismissed or buried by higher-ups in the department. It seemed like the officers weren't just reckless. They were protected. But what really caught John's attention was a connection between the police department and something bigger, a powerful crime syndicate operating quietly in the city. At first glance, it didn't make sense why local cops would be tied to organized crime. But as John pieced together fragments of information, a clearer picture began to emerge. The syndicate ran illegal gambling rings, drug operations, and protection rackets throughout the area. In exchange for turning a blind eye or actively helping cover up crimes, The police received bribes, favors, and immunity from scrutiny. The same officers responsible for Max's death were part of this web, using their badges as shields while enabling criminal activity. John's investigation wasn't easy. He worked late into the night, poring over documents and cross-referencing data. During the day, he tried to keep things normal for Emily, taking her out for ice cream or teaching her how to ride her bike again, even though she still seemed distant and withdrawn. She noticed her dad spending more time on his computer and making mysterious phone calls, but when she asked, he simply said, "I'm trying to fix things." Deep down, Emily trusted him completely, even if she didn't fully understand what he was doing. As John gathered evidence, he realized the scale of the problem was far greater than he'd initially thought. This wasn't just about two corrupt officers. It was about an entire system designed to protect itself at any cost. If he wanted justice for Max, he couldn't stop at exposing the men who pulled the trigger. He needed to dismantle the network that allowed them to act with impunity. One evening, as John sat alone in the dim light of his study, he stared at the growing pile of notes and files spread across his desk. His mind flashed back to his days in Delta Force, where every mission required careful planning and flawless execution. This was no different. He began mapping out a strategy, identifying weak points in the system, and figuring out how to exploit them. He decided to start small, planting seeds of doubt within the department, creating cracks in the foundation, so the whole structure would eventually crumble. By the time he turned off the lamp and went to bed, John had a clear vision of what he needed to do. He wouldn't just seek revenge or demand apologies. He would expose the truth in a way that couldn't be ignored. For Emily, for Max, and for everyone else who had been failed by those meant to protect them, John vowed to bring the fight to those who thought they were untouchable. And unlike the criminals and corrupt officials he was targeting, John had one advantage. He had nothing left to lose. John Dawson's days became a blur of quiet determination and calculated moves. He worked tirelessly, piecing together the puzzle that connected the corrupt officers to the shadowy crime syndicate pulling strings behind the scenes. But as he delved deeper into the investigation, memories from his past began creeping into his mind, memories he had tried so hard to bury. Late at night, when the house was silent and Emily was asleep, John would sit in the dim glow of his laptop, staring at the screen but seeing something else entirely. He remembered a mission gone horribly wrong, a raid on a suspected insurgent compound in a remote desert village. Intelligence reports had promised clear targets, but when they arrived, the building was filled with families. Women, children, elders, all caught in the crossfire. John had been the one to call it off, shouting orders to retreat, but not before innocent lives were lost. The faces of those victims haunted him still, their cries echoing in his dreams. That mission had cost him more than just sleep. It had shaken his faith in systems designed to protect people. It was why he left active duty, choosing instead to live quietly with Emily while taking contracts overseas only when necessary. Now, sitting in his suburban home, John realized how much the tragedy shaped him. It wasn't just guilt driving him. It was a deep-seated need to make things right, even if it meant stepping back into the shadows where danger lurked. He couldn't let another group of powerful people abuse their authority without consequences. Not again. Not here. Not to his daughter. As John continued gathering evidence, he noticed subtle changes around town. Things felt off. Officers who once patrolled casually now seemed tense, constantly scanning their surroundings as if expecting trouble. Surveillance cameras installed near the police station appeared to have been tampered with, their feeds momentarily blacking out at odd intervals. Files went missing from the department archives, and whispers of an inside job spread among the ranks. The officers involved in Max's death grew increasingly paranoid, jumping at every sound, snapping at each other during briefings. They knew someone was watching them, but they had no idea who or how close the threat truly was. John played his cards carefully, using psychological tactics he learned in Delta Force to keep them guessing. He started small, leaving anonymous notes slipped under windshield wipers, cryptic messages scrawled on bathroom mirrors inside the station, or harmless pranks like rearranging office furniture overnight. Nothing overtly dangerous, just enough to plant seeds of doubt and unease. Each act was designed to isolate the corrupt officers, making them question whether their colleagues could be trusted, or worse, whether someone within the department was working against them. At the same time, John leaked fragments of information to local journalists and watchdog groups, ensuring the public pressure mounted steadily. Every new revelation chipped away at the facade of invincibility the police department had built for itself. Neighbors who had once dismissed Emily's story as a tragic accident now saw the bigger picture. Conversations at grocery stores and coffee shops turned to murmurs about accountability and reform. Even some honest officers within the department grew restless, torn between loyalty to their badge and disgust at what was unfolding. Through it all, John remained invisible, a ghost moving through the cracks of the system. His military training made him a master of blending in, staying unnoticed while orchestrating chaos from the sidelines. Yet, despite his focus, there were moments when his resolve wavered. Late at night, after another long day of strategizing, he'd find himself standing outside in the backyard, staring at the spot where Max used to play. The emptiness hit him hardest then, not just the loss of the dog, but the pain etched on Emily's face whenever she thought no one was looking. Still, John pushed forward. This wasn't just about Max anymore. It was about breaking the cycle of corruption that preyed on the vulnerable. It was about proving to Emily that justice was possible, even when the odds seemed impossible. And most importantly, it was about showing the world that no matter how powerful or untouchable someone might seem, everyone eventually answers to someone. For John Dawson, the reckoning was coming, and he intended to make sure it arrived sooner rather than later. John Dawson's plan was falling into place, piece by careful piece. He had spent weeks laying the groundwork, planting seeds of distrust within the police department and gathering irrefutable evidence to expose the corruption. But now it was time to tighten the noose. The officers involved in Max's death, and the crime syndicate they worked for, were about to learn that their actions had consequences far beyond what they could imagine. The key to John's strategy was creating a trap so airtight that his targets wouldn't even realize they were walking into it until it was too late. Using fake identities and encrypted communication channels, he posed as an informant with critical information about the syndicate's operations. He leaked just enough details to pique their interest, but kept the most damning evidence hidden, dangling it like bait. The goal was simple: lure them into a situation where their own greed and arrogance would seal their fate. One evening, John intercepted a message from one of the corrupt officers, a coded request sent to the syndicate's leader, asking for cleanup assistance on an upcoming drug raid. It was clear they planned to use the operation as cover for moving stolen goods and laundering money. John seized the opportunity, planting forged documents among the officers' files that implicated him in leaking sensitive information to federal investigators. To make it believable, he added surveillance photos, carefully altered, showing the officer meeting with a fictitious whistleblower. Then he tipped off another high-ranking member of the syndicate, suggesting the officer might be working as a double agent. The result was chaos. Within hours, paranoia spread like wildfire through both the police department and the syndicate. Accusations flew back and forth, alliances crumbled, and trust evaporated. The officers involved in Max's death found themselves under intense scrutiny, not only from their superiors, but also from the criminals they served. Their attempts to deflect blame only dug them deeper into trouble, exposing more cracks in their carefully constructed lies. Meanwhile, John orchestrated the final phase of his plan. He arranged for the drug raid to take place in broad daylight, ensuring maximum visibility. He tipped off local news crews anonymously, feeding them vague hints about a major bust involving law enforcement misconduct. By the time the operation began, cameras were rolling, reporters were stationed nearby, and the entire neighborhood buzzed with anticipation. When the raid went south, as John knew it would, The fallout was explosive. Officers stormed the wrong house, mistaking innocent civilians for suspects due to bad intel planted by John himself. When confronted, tempers flared, and the officers' true colors came out. One shouted orders to fabricate evidence, while another tried to bribe witnesses into silence. All of it was captured live on camera, broadcast to thousands of viewers across the city. Back at home, Emily watched the news with wide eyes, unsure how to process what she was seeing. She turned to her father, who stood silently in the doorway, arms crossed. "Dad," she whispered, "did you do this?" John knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I didn't pull the trigger or plant the evidence," he said calmly. "But I made sure the truth couldn't stay hidden anymore." Though Emily didn't fully understand the complexity of what her father had done, she felt a flicker of hope for the first time since losing Max. Justice wasn't just a word, it was something tangible, something worth fighting for. And as the scandal unfolded on screen, John knew the hardest part was yet to come. The officers would scramble to save themselves, pointing fingers and dragging others down with them. But John had already prepared for that. Every lie they told, every attempt to cover their tracks, only buried them deeper. By the end of the day, the once unshakable walls of power began to crack. For John, it was proof that even the strongest fortresses could collapse when built on a foundation of deceit. Now, all that remained was delivering the final blow. A confrontation that would leave no room for escape. The storm John Dawson had been carefully brewing was now in full force, and the fallout from the botched drug raid dominated every conversation in town. The news channels replayed footage of the officers' misconduct on an endless loop, dissecting their actions frame by frame. Social media erupted with outrage as citizens demanded answers. How could this happen? Who was responsible? And why had no one noticed the rot within the police department sooner? For the corrupt officers involved in Max's death, the pressure became unbearable. They tried to shift blame onto each other, concocting stories that contradicted one another and only deepened the public's distrust. Their superiors called emergency meetings behind closed doors, desperate to contain the damage before it spread further. But John knew better than anyone. Once the truth started leaking, there was no stopping it. Late one night, John decided it was time for the final phase of his plan, a direct confrontation. He chose his target carefully, the lead officer who had fired the shot that killed Max. This man wasn't just guilty of pulling the trigger. He was the linchpin holding the entire web of corruption together. If John could break him, the rest would crumble like a house of cards. John tracked the officer to a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of town, a place where cops often went to blow off steam away from prying eyes. Sitting alone at the counter, nursing a drink, the officer looked haggard, his usual bravado replaced by fear. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the glass to his lips. When John slid onto the stool beside him, the officer barely glanced up, too consumed by his own thoughts to notice the stranger next to him. "Rough day?" John asked casually, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made the officer stiffen. The man shrugged, muttering something about stress and long hours. John nodded sympathetically, letting silence hang between them for a moment before speaking again. "You know," he said quietly, "people make mistakes. Sometimes big ones, but when those mistakes hurt innocent people, kids, even, it changes things." The officer froze, his glass halfway to his mouth. Slowly, he turned to look at John, his face pale. "What are you talking about?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. John leaned closer, his piercing gaze locking onto the officer's. "I'm talking about my daughter. About her dog. About the reckless choice you made that ruined her life. And yours." Realization dawned on the officer's face, followed quickly by panic. He stammered, trying to defend himself, but John cut him off. "It doesn't matter what excuses you have," he said firmly. "What matters is what happens next. You can keep lying, keep digging yourself deeper, or you can do the right thing, for once in your life." Reaching into his pocket, John placed a small digital recorder on the counter between them. "Confess everything," he instructed. "Every dirty deal, every cover-up, every name connected to the syndicate. Do it live, on camera, and send it to every news outlet in the city. Or I'll make sure the world finds out exactly who you are and what you've done, in ways you can't imagine." The threat hung heavy in the air. The officer stared at the recorder, his mind racing. He knew John wasn't bluffing. Everything falling apart around him, the scandal, the media frenzy, the distrust within his own ranks, was proof enough of the man's capabilities. For the first time in years, the officer felt truly powerless. After a long, tense silence, he nodded shakily. "Okay," he whispered. "I'll do it." John didn't celebrate. He simply stood, leaving the recorder behind as he walked out of the bar. As he drove home, his thoughts drifted to Emily. He thought about how much she had suffered, how brave she had been despite everything. What he was doing wasn't revenge, it was justice. A chance to rebuild trust, not just for his family, but for everyone who had been failed by the system. By morning, the confession was everywhere. The officer spilled every secret, implicating not only himself, but also high-ranking officials tied to the syndicate. The city reeled from the revelations, demanding accountability. And while John stayed out of the spotlight, watching silently from the sidelines, he allowed himself a small sense of satisfaction. The walls were crumbling, and there was no going back. The confession sent shockwaves through the city, rippling far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. The officer's recorded admission aired on every major news channel, spreading like wildfire across social media platforms. His voice trembled as he detailed years of corruption, bribery, cover-ups, illegal deals with the crime syndicate, all laid bare for the world to see. Names were named, connections exposed, and the facade of integrity that the police department had clung to for so long crumbled into dust. Within hours, arrests began. Not just low-level officers, but high-ranking officials, including the police chief, were dragged out of their homes in handcuffs. Reporters camped outside the station, capturing footage of stunned officers being questioned or suspended pending investigation. The crime syndicate, once thought untouchable, unraveled under federal scrutiny. Their operations were dismantled piece by piece, leaving behind a trail of chaos and shattered reputations. For Emily Dawson, watching the events unfold felt surreal. She sat cross-legged on the living room floor, clutching a framed photo of Max, her eyes glued to the television screen. Each revelation brought a mix of emotions: anger at how deeply rooted the corruption ran, relief that the truth was finally coming out, and sadness over the loss she couldn't undo. When the newscaster mentioned the death of an innocent family pet during one segment, Emily lowered her head, tears streaming down her face. John knelt beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "It won't bring Max back," he said softly, his voice steady despite the weight of everything they'd been through. "But it means no one else has to go through what we did." Emily nodded, leaning into him. For the first time since losing Max, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for herself, but for others who might now be protected because of what her father had done. Meanwhile, the neighborhood buzzed with conversation. Neighbors who had initially dismissed Emily's story as a tragic accident now apologized profusely, offering condolences and support. Some even organized a small memorial for Max in the park, inviting Emily to place flowers beneath a tree dedicated to his memory. It wasn't much, but it helped heal some of the wounds left behind. Behind the scenes, John remained vigilant. Though the immediate threat had been neutralized, he knew better than to assume the fight was over. Systems like this didn't die easily. They adapted, finding new ways to survive. Still, he took solace in knowing he'd struck a significant blow, one that would force reforms and accountability, if only for a while. As days turned into weeks, life in the suburbs slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could get after such upheaval. The scandal became a turning point for the community, sparking conversations about transparency and trust in law enforcement. Town hall meetings filled with concerned citizens demanding change, and local leaders vowed to implement stricter oversight measures. For John, the experience changed him in subtle ways. He still carried the scars of his past, the guilt of lives lost during missions, the sacrifices made in the name of duty. But he also found a renewed sense of purpose. Protecting Emily wasn't just about shielding her from harm. It was about teaching her that standing up for what's right mattered, even when the odds seemed impossible. One evening, as they walked together in the park where Max's memorial stood, Emily looked up at her father. "Do you think things will really get better?" she asked, her voice tinged with both curiosity and cautious optimism. John smiled faintly, gazing at the horizon painted orange by the setting sun. "They already are," he replied. "But it's up to us, and people like us, to make sure they stay that way." And for the first time in months, Emily believed him. The months that followed the scandal brought a wave of change to the quiet suburb. The once stable police department underwent a complete overhaul, with federal investigators stepping in to root out lingering corruption. New leadership was appointed, and policies were rewritten with transparency and accountability at their core. Officers who had quietly opposed the old regime began speaking up, sharing stories of intimidation and coercion they'd endured for years. It was as if the entire town had awakened from a long, uneasy sleep, ready to confront the truths it had ignored for too long. For Emily Dawson, life slowly started to feel lighter. She still missed Max terribly, his wagging tail, his comforting presence, but she found solace in the way his memory inspired others. The memorial in the park became a gathering spot not just for her but for neighbors who wanted to honor him. Some brought flowers, others left handwritten notes thanking Max for being a symbol of justice. One day, a little girl approached Emily shyly, holding out a drawing of a golden retriever surrounded by hearts. "Is this what Max looked like?" she asked. Emily nodded, smiling through tears. "Yeah," she said softly. "That's exactly what he looked like." But more than anything, Emily felt proud. Proud of her dad for standing up when no one else would, proud of herself for enduring the pain without giving up, and proud of her community for coming together to demand better. She realized something important. Even though Max was gone, his legacy lived on, not just in memories, but in the changes he'd helped spark. John, too, experienced a shift. Though he never sought recognition, whispers about his role in exposing the corruption eventually reached the neighborhood. People began treating him differently, some with awe, others with gratitude. But John didn't want praise. He simply wanted to move forward, focusing on rebuilding a sense of normalcy for his family. Still, there were moments when he allowed himself to reflect on what he'd done. Late at night, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, he thought about the ripple effect of his actions, how one act of injustice against a child and her dog had unveiled a web of wrongdoing affecting countless lives, and how, sometimes, doing the right thing meant taking risks, even when those risks came with costs. Emily noticed these changes in her father. He seemed quieter, more introspective, yet also warmer somehow. Gone was the distant man who often buried himself in work or disappeared into his study for hours. In his place was someone who laughed more, listened intently, and made time for small joys, like teaching Emily how to bake cookies or helping her build a birdhouse for the backyard. These moments weren't grand gestures, but they mattered deeply to both of them. One evening, as they sat side by side watching the sunset, Emily turned to her dad. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. "I mean, after all this." John smiled faintly, leaning back in his chair. "I think I'll stick around here for a while," he replied. "Maybe take some classes online, learn new things, spend more time with you." Then, after a pause, he added, "And maybe help keep an eye on things around here, just to make sure nobody forgets what happened." Emily grinned, nudging him playfully. "You're like a superhero, Dad," she teased. "A secret one." John chuckled, shaking his head. "Not a superhero," he corrected gently. "Just someone who believes people deserve better. That's all." As weeks turned into months, Emily began dreaming bigger. Inspired by her father's courage, she decided she wanted to become a lawyer someday, a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. She started reading books about justice systems and human rights, jotting down questions to ask her teachers. John encouraged her every step of the way, knowing that her determination would carry her far. Life wasn't perfect. It never truly could be again after losing Max, but it was moving forward. The scars remained, but so did the lessons learned. For John and Emily, the tragedy had transformed them, strengthening their bond and deepening their commitment to making the world a better place. And as they stood together under the big oak tree in their backyard one crisp autumn afternoon, watching leaves swirl in the breeze, they shared a silent understanding. Justice wasn't just about punishing wrongdoers. It was about protecting futures, about ensuring that no child ever had to cry over a loss caused by negligence or greed, about building a world where trust mattered more than power. Max may have been gone, but his spirit lingered. In the laughter of a healed community, in the dreams of a young girl determined to fight for fairness, and in the quiet resolve of a father who refused to let darkness win.